In 1934, a French maid later claimed she had witnessed something very funny between Gloria Vanderbilt and a titled British lady, a story that would soon erupt into an international scandal. Instead, the maid alleged she saw the young widow and the king's cousin in an intimacy that in 1934 was unspeakable in polite society. This was the explosive testimony that turned the Vanderbilt custody trial into the scandal of the century. The woman accused of unnatural acts was Nadejda, Mountbatten, the Marchioness of Milford Haven. Born of Romanov blood and married into the heart of the House of Windsor, Nadejda led a dangerous double life. Behind the tiaras and the royal titles lay a world of underground lesbian affairs, gender-bending rebellion, and a secret hedonism that threatened to bring the monarchy to its knees. This is the story of the aristocrat who lived in the shadows of the Jazz Age and the keyhole that nearly destroyed her. Nadejda's story began long before that courtroom, in a world that had already vanished into the ashes of history. She was born in 1896, not in the snow-swept palaces of St. Petersburg, but in the sun-drenched, manicured isolation of the south of France. She was a child of the Romanovs, but she was also a mistake. Her father was Grand Duke Michael Melovich of Russia, a grandson of Tsar Nicholas I. He was a man of immense physical stature and crushing arrogance, a quintessential Russian autocrat who believed the world existed solely to be ordered by his command. But Michael had committed the one sin the Romanov dynasty could not forgive. He had married for love, and he had married beneath him. In 1891, the Grand Duke had fallen obsessively in love with Sophie of Marienburg. Sophie was a woman of undeniable beauty and sharp intelligence, but her bloodline was politically fatal. She was the granddaughter of Alexander Pushkin, the greatest poet in Russian history. Pushkin, a man of African descent, his great-grandfather was Ibrahim Ganabal, an enslaved African who became a general under Peter the Great, was a national hero, but he was not royalty. To the rigid, frozen court of Tsar Alexander III, Sophie was a commoner. When Michael defied the Tsar and married her in San Remo, the reaction from Russia was swift and brutal. The marriage was declared illegal. Michael was stripped of his military rank, banished from Russia, and forbidden from ever returning to his homeland. Thus, Na entered the world as a paradox. She was technically a Grand Duchess, yet she had no country. She possessed immense wealth. Her father had managed to keep his fortune, but she was a social pariah in the eyes of the royal courts of Europe. She grew up in a golden cage. The family settled in England at Kenwood House and spent their winters in Kay at the Villa Casbeck. It was a life of opulent aimlessness. Her father, the bitter Grand Duke, spent his days playing golf and tyrannizing his household, raging against the Tsar who had cast him out, while her mother, the Countess Dorby, navigated the treacherous waters of European high society with a frozen smile. From her earliest years, Na understood that she was different. While her English cousins were pale, fair-haired, and placid, Nadejda was dark. She had inherited the striking features of her African ancestor, Ganabal. Her skin was olive, her eyes were dark and hooded, her lips full and sullen. In the polite pastel drawing rooms of Edwardian England, she looked like a panther trapped in a petting zoo. She was exotic, moody, and visibly other. The British aristocracy, obsessed with pedigree and conformity, didn't know what to make of her. They whispered about her Tartar blood and her Russian temperament. This sense of alienation forged a personality of steel. Nadejda learned early on that the rules of society were arbitrary. The Tsar had banished her father for love. The British accepted them only because of their money and their vague connection to the throne. She saw the hypocrisy of the ruling class before she was 10 years old. She watched her father bow to men he considered his inferiors simply to maintain his social standing. She watched her mother endure the snubs of lesser royals who refused to accord her the proper precedence at dinner parties. Nadejda absorbed it all, and it curdled into a deep, cynical disdain for authority. If the world was going to treat her as an outsider, she would own that status. She would not beg for acceptance. She would command attention. As she grew into a young woman, the First World War shattered the delicate ecosystem of her youth. The conflict was a catastrophe for her family. But in a twisted irony, it was their salvation. When the Russian Revolution erupted in 1917, the Bolsheviks hunted down the Romanovs with ruthless efficiency. They murdered the Tsar, his wife, and their children in the cellar at Arenberg. They threw Na's cousins down mine shafts in Aleptik. But because Nada's father had been banished decades earlier, because they were the illegitimate branch living in England, they were safe. The exile that Michael had cursed for 20 years was the only reason his daughter was alive. But survival came at a cost. To survive in wartime England, where anti-German sentiment was at a fever pitch, the family had to shed their skin. Her future husband's family, the Battenbergs, were German princes living in Britain. In 1917, King George V ordered them to anglicize their name. Battenberg became Mountbatten. They stripped the German titles from their coats of arms and reinvented themselves as purely British patriots. Nada watched this transformation with a cool, detached eye. She saw how easily a name could be changed, how quickly an identity could be discarded to survive. It was a lesson she would take to heart. Identity is a performance. In 1916, amidst the chaos of the war, Nada married Prince George of Battenberg, soon to be the second Marquis of Milford Haven. On paper, it was a brilliant match. George was the brother of Louis Mountbatten and Alice of Battenberg, Prince Philip's mother. He was brilliant, a mathematical genius who could calculate complex gunnery trajectories in his head. He was a naval officer of the highest caliber, dedicated to the service of the king. But he was also a man of immense complexity. George was distant, often lost in his own intellectual world, and possessed a collection of erotica that hinted at a mind unbothered by conventional morality. The marriage was a union of two highly intelligent, misplaced souls. George was a German prince turned British sailor. Na was a Russian Grand Duchess turned British Marchioness. They were the ultimate insiders who felt like outsiders. They understood each other's isolation. But while George channeled his energy into the Navy and his books, Nada found herself adrift in a post-war world that was rapidly shedding its inhibitions. The 1920s arrived not with a whimper, but with a scream of jazz saxophones and the roar of Bentley engines. The old world of corsets, chaperones, and tea dances was dead, buried in the mud of Flanders. In its place came the bright young things, a generation of aristocrats who were determined to dance until they collapsed, to drink until they forgot the war, and to break every rule their parents had held sacred. Nadejda Mountbatten did not just join this revolution, she became one of its dark generals. She looked at the traditional role of a marchioness, hosting charity fetes, opening garden parties, producing heirs, and she rejected it with a laugh. She cut her hair. It wasn't just a bob, it was a severe, slick-back crop that exposed the sharp angles of her face. She stopped wearing the flowing feminine gowns of the pre-war era and began to raid her husband's wardrobe. She wore trousers, tailored jackets, and monleys. She smoked heavy Turkish tobacco out of a long ebony holder, clamping it between her teeth with a masculine swagger. This was the era of Lagaron, the boy girl, and Na embodied it perfectly. She was striking, terrifyingly chic, and deeply androgynous. In the fluid underground of 1920s London and Paris, she was a sensation. She drove fast cars with a reckless disregard for safety. She played tennis with a ferocity that frightened her opponents. She moved through the nightclubs of Mayfair like a dark queen, flanked by the most beautiful and scandalous women of the age. It was during these years that the rumors began. At first, they were whispers in the smoking rooms of gentlemen's clubs. Men would talk about how the Marchioness seemed to prefer the company of women, how her friendships were too intense, too tactile. But in the 1920s, the aristocracy operated on a strict code of omnia. You could do anything you wanted. take drugs, sleep with anyone, gamble away fortunes. As long as you did not frighten the horses, as long as you kept up appearances, the doors of society remained open. Na played this game expertly. She produced 2 children, fulfilling her dynastic duty. She appeared at court functions standing dutifully beside her husband. She curtsied to the king. But the moment the official duties were over, she retreated into a private world that was becoming increasingly female-centric. Her marriage to George evolved into a modern, sophisticated arrangement. They were partners, friends, and co-conspirators. But the romantic passion, if it had ever existed, had cooled into a mutual respect for each other's freedom. George had his naval career and his intellectual pursuits. Nadejda had her friends. And the closest of all these friends was her sister-in-law, Edwina Mountbatten. When Lord Louis Mountbatten married the immensely wealthy heiress, Edwina Ashley, in 1922, he brought into the family a woman who matched Na in restlessness and rebellion. Edwina was beautiful, rich beyond avarice, and completely bored by convention. The 2 women, Nadejda and Edwina, formed an instant, impenetrable alliance. They were the Mountbatten girls, a terrifying duo who intimidated men and fascinated women. They began to travel together, leaving their husbands behind. These were not spa holidays to Switzerland. They went on grueling, dangerous expeditions to the wildest corners of the earth. They talked through the deserts of Persia, mapped the jungles of Southeast Asia, and crossed the Andes. They slept in the same tent, shared the same hardships, and lived for months at a time in a world where the rules of London society did not apply. In the isolation of the desert or the jungle, the boundaries of their relationship blurred. They were soulmates in a way that their husbands could never understand. By the early 1930s, Nadejda Mountbatten was living a carefully managed double life. Respectable marchioness in London, and a far freer figure on the Riviera. To the public, she was the respectable marchioness, the cousin of the king, a pillar of the establishment. To the underground, she was a liberated icon, a woman who loved whom she wanted and lived how she pleased. She believed she was untouchable. She believed that her name, her title, and the protective wall of the royal family would always shield her from the consequences of her desires. She was wrong. Across the Atlantic, a storm was gathering that cared nothing for royal titles. In the high-stakes world of American high society, a feud was brewing within the Vanderbilt family that would require a sacrificial lamb. They needed a villain to destroy the reputation of Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt. They needed proof of depravity. And unknowingly, in her visits to Kay, in the quiet intimacy of closed bedrooms, Na Mountbatten had walked straight into the trap. The maid, Marie Ko, was watching. The keyhole was waiting. And the precarious balance of Nada's 2 worlds was about to be shattered by a single, devastating testimony. The tragedy of Nadejda Mountbatten's early life was that she was trained for a world that no longer existed. She was raised to be a Romanov Grand Duchess in an era when Romanovs were being lined up against walls and shot. She was raised to be a British purist in an era when the aristocracy was losing its moral authority. She adapted by becoming a chameleon, hiding her true self behind a mask of androgynous glamour and icy detachment. But the danger of wearing a mask is that you eventually forget that it can be ripped off. As 1934 approached, Na felt secure. Her husband George was rising in the Navy. Her children were in school. Her friendship with Gloria Vanderbilt was just another chapter in her life of private pleasures.
She did not realize that in America, the rules were different. The American press did not respect the Omar, the British upper class. They were hungry for blood, and blue blood was the sweetest of all. As Nate boarded the ocean liner Majestic to visit New York, thinking she was merely visiting a friend, she was actually sailing into a hurricane that would force her to fight for her reputation, her children, and the very survival of the House of Mountbatten. The exile of Kay was over. The trial of the century was about to begin. In London, she was the
Marchionessa Milford Haven, a beautiful member of the extended royal family who attended coronations and charity balls with a face of impassive nobility. But the moment she crossed the English Channel, the corset of protocol was unlaced. The south of France was her playground, a sun-drenched sanctuary where the moral laws of England evaporated in the heat. It was here, amidst the pine-scented hills of Cannes and the casinos of Monte Carlo, that Nadejda held court. And it was here that she forged the friendship that would nearly destroy her. Enter Gloria Morgan, Vanderbilt. If Na was the dark, brooding panther of the aristocracy, Gloria was the fragile, trembling dove. Born into the diplomatically connected Morgan family, Gloria had married Reggie, Vanderbilt, the heir to the massive railroad fortune. It was a match made in tabloid heaven, beauty and money. But Reggie was a gambler and an alcoholic who drank himself to death by 1925, leaving Gloria, a widow at 20 with a baby daughter, also named Gloria, and a mountain of debt hidden behind a wall of trust funds. Gloria was beautiful, feckless, and utterly lost. She was terrified of solitude and incapable of managing her own life, let alone a massive fortune. She drifted to Europe, seeking comfort in the company of the aristocracy. When she met Nadejda Mountbatten, the attraction was immediate and magnetic. Nadejda was everything Gloria was not: strong, decisive, protected by royal armor, and possessing a masculine confidence that Gloria found intoxicating. Nadejda became her protector, her mentor, and according to the whispers, her lover. The two women became inseparable. They were seen everywhere together on the Riviera. They dined at the most exclusive tables, danced until dawn, and spent long, languid afternoons at Nadejda's villa. To the casual observer, it was a deep female friendship. But the servants saw something else. They saw the way Na looked at Gloria. They saw the bedroom doors that were locked in the middle of the afternoon. They saw the physical intimacy that went beyond the chasted embraces of society ladies in the glass closet of the 1930s. This was dangerous, but manageable. Everyone knew, but no one spoke. As long as the curtains were drawn, the fiction could be maintained. But in New York, a storm was brewing that would rip the curtains down. The storm's name was Gertrude Vanderbilt, Whitney. Gertrude was Reggie Vanderbilt's sister, a sculptor, a philanthropist, and the founder of the Whitney Museum. She was a woman of immense power and rigid old-school morality. She despised Gloria. She viewed her sister-in-law as a parasitic socialite who was squandering the Vanderbilt name and, more importantly, neglecting the Vanderbilt heir, little Gloria. Gertrude believed that the child was being dragged across Europe like a piece of luggage, raised by nannies while her mother partied with questionable royals. In 1934, Gertrude launched a legal nuclear strike. She sued for full custody of the child, little Gloria. Custody battles in the 1930s were rare and usually settled quietly, but Gertrude didn't want a settlement. She wanted a destruction to strip a mother of her child. She had to prove that Gloria was not just negligent, but morally unfit. Neglect was a weak argument against a mother who loved her child. Gertrude needed something darker. She needed depravity. She needed a sin so unspeakable that no judge in America would let the child remain in that environment. Gertrude's lawyers dispatched private investigators to Europe. They interviewed fired maids, disgruntled chauffeur, and bitter nannies. They were digging for dirt, and, in the servants' quarters of K, they struck gold. They found Marie Quot. Marie Quot was a former maid of Gloria's. She was young, impressionable, and seemingly shocked by what she had witnessed in the Vanderbilt household. The lawyers brought her to New York. They prepped her. They knew that her testimony was a bomb that would blow up not just the trial, but international relations. The trial began in October 1934 at the New York Supreme Court. It was a circus. The Great Depression was ravaging America. The people were hungry, angry, and desperate for distraction. The Vanderbilt War was the ultimate soap opera. Crowds packed the courthouse, desperate to catch a glimpse of the poor little rich girl and her warring relatives. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. For the first few weeks, the testimony focused on money and parenting, but Gertrude's lawyers were holding their ace card. Then they called Marie Quot to the stand. The moment Quot sat down, the air in the room changed. The lawyers asked the judge to clear the courtroom. They argued that the testimony would be filthy and damaging to public morals. Justice Carew agreed. The reporters were shoved out. The doors were locked. But in a courthouse, walls have ears. Quot began to speak. Through a translator, she described life in the villa in Cannes. She spoke of the close friendship between Mrs. Vanderbilt and Lady Milford Haven. Then the lawyer asked the fatal question, "What did you see?" Quot testified that one afternoon, driven by suspicion, she had knelt outside the bedroom door. She put her eye to the keyhole. She described seeing Mrs. Vanderbilt and Lady Milford Haven on the bed. They were kissing, but it wasn't just kissing. Quot used language that, even in translation, left no room for ambiguity. She described unnatural acts. She described a physical passion that was predatory and intense. She painted Na not just as a lover, but as the aggressor, the dominant force who had corrupted the weak American widow. It was a sensation. In 1934, lesbianism was not discussed in polite society. It was considered a mental illness, a perversion. For a mother to be accused of it was the ultimate disqualification. But for that mother's lover to be a member of the British royal family, it was cataclysmic. The news leaked within hours. The tabloids couldn't print the specific details due to obscenity laws, but they printed everything else. Vanderbilt Maid tells of keyhole peep titled, "British Lady Named in Love Nest, Scandal Rocks Royal Family in London." The reaction was one of frozen horror. King George V was ailing. The monarchy was trying to project an image of dull, solid stability to counter the rise of fascism in Europe. And now the newspapers were linking the king's cousin to a lesbian sex cult in New York. Nadejda was at her country home in England when the news broke. Most women would have collapsed. A scandal of this magnitude usually resulted in social exile. The standard protocol was to retreat, to go to a sanatorium for nerves, and to vanish until the world forgot. Nadejda Mountbatten did not vanish. She read the reports. She saw her name smeared across the front pages of the world, and she reacted with the cold, imperious fury of her Romanov ancestors. She did not hide. Furious, the Marchioness denounced the claims as monstrous and dispatched her solicitor from London to monitor the proceedings. It was a move of breathtaking audacity. She was sailing straight into the eye of the storm. Rather than quietly disappear, she moved to protect her name through lawyers and behind-the-scenes pressure. As the ship crossed the Atlantic, the press frenzy reached a fever pitch. They were waiting for her on the docks of New York like a pack of wolves. In the press, she became a character overnight. The titled British relative dragged into America's loudest custody trial. She was dressed entirely in black, a sharp tailored suit, a black hat pulled low, and dark gloves. She looked like an executioner. She did not run to a waiting car. She stood there, lit by the flashbulbs, and issued a statement that was brief, icy, and defiant. "The stories are malicious lies," she said, her voice clipped and aristocratic. "I am here to defend my honor and the honor of my family." She didn't look like a woman accused of perversion. She looked like a queen who had arrived to punish her subjects. She went straight to the courthouse. She demanded to confront her accuser. The scene in Justice Caru's chambers was electric. On one side, the Vanderbilt lawyers smug and armed with their witness. On the other, native Mountbatten, radiating a terrifying calm. Behind closed doors, lawyers battled over what could be said and how much of it the public would be allowed to hear. She did not weep. She did not plead for mercy. She treated the accusation with utter disdain. She dismantled Mariko's character with surgical precision. How could a maid see through a keyhole that was blocked by a key? Why had she waited so long to speak? Was she paid by the Whitney family? Nadejda's defense was simple. The accusation was so beneath her dignity that it couldn't possibly be true. She used her class as a shield. She was a Mountbatten. Kyo was a peasant. Who were they going to believe? Justice Caru was in a bind. He was an Irish-American Catholic judge, deeply conservative. But he was also overwhelmed by the diplomatic pressure. Diplomatic pressure and elite influence swirled around the case as the British establishment watched nervously. The palace could hardly ignore it as the headlines began linking royalty to American courtroom scandal. And in front of him sat a woman of formidable power, who was tearing his courtroom apart with sheer force of will. In the end, Caru made a decision that saved Na, but condemned Gloria. He ruled that the maid's testimony was unreliable, and more importantly, irrelevant to the core issue of the child's welfare. At that point, Justice Caru shut the courtroom to the press and the public, determined to keep the most salacious testimony from exploding in open session. He ordered the most sensitive testimony handled behind closed doors, limiting what could be reported. In legal terms, the court tried to keep the most explosive allegations out of public view. But the scandal was already alive in the headlines. Na had won. She had stared down the American legal system and forced it to blink. But the victory was a Pyrrhic one. The testimony was struck from the record, but it could not be struck from the public imagination. Everyone knew. The headlines had already been printed. The lesbian marchioness was now a permanent part of her identity. She left the courthouse, her head high, but she left her friend behind. Gloria Vanderbilt lost the case. She lost custody of her daughter. Gertrude Whitney had won. Gloria was branded an unfit mother, not legally because of the lesbian affair, but the cloud of the accusation hung over the final verdict. She was destroyed. Nada returned to the Majestic to sail back to England. She had defended the royal name. She had prevented a total collapse of her family's reputation. But as she stood on the deck watching the New York skyline recede, she knew that her world had changed forever. The glass closet had been shattered. The privacy that the aristocracy had enjoyed for centuries was gone. She was now a marked woman, a figure of scandal who would be whispered about for the rest of her life. And back in England, the royal family was waiting. They were grateful. She had killed the story, yes, but forgiveness, that was a different matter entirely. The Queen of the Night was coming home, but the palace gates were about to be bolted shut against her. The Vanderbilt trial of 1934 stands as a watershed moment in the history of queer high society. It was one of the first times that the fluid, secretive sexuality of the upper classes
was dragged into the harsh light of a modern courtroom. For Na, it was a brutal lesson in the limits of privilege. She discovered that her title could protect her from legal consequences, but it could not protect her from shame. Yet there is something undeniably heroic in her refusal to hide. In an era when women accused of such things were expected to disappear or commit suicide, Nadejda Mountbatten put on her best suit and went to war. She defended her identity by denying it, a complex paradox that defined her survival. She saved herself, but she couldn't save Gloria. The friendship that had sparked the scandal withered in the aftermath. Gloria Vanderbilt spent the rest of her life as a tragic, faded figure, forever mourning the loss of her child and her reputation. Na, however, had other battles to fight. The 1930s were ending. The drums of war were beating again, and the Mountbatten family was about to be pulled into a conflict that would make the scandal in New York look like a tea party. The Russian exile was about to face the German war machine. The return of the Marchioness of Milford Haven to England in the winter of 1934 was not a homecoming. It was a retreat into a fortress of silence. The RMS Majestic docked in Southampton under a lean gray sky, a stark contrast to the flash-bold hysteria of New York. Nadejda disembarked with her head held high, her face a mask of impenetrable Romanov disdain. But she knew the landscape had shifted. She had survived the legal storm as the court pushed the most salacious allegations behind closed doors. But in Mayfair drawing rooms and palace corridors, the social verdict was brutally clear. The British aristocracy operates on a system of invisible signals. There were no public denunciations. She was not stripped of her title. She was not barred from the royal enclosure at Ascot. Instead, the temperature simply dropped. When she entered a room, conversations would pause for a fraction of a second too long. When she attended court functions, the circle of space around her was slightly wider than before. She was the woman from the newspapers, the figure who had allowed the vulgarity of American sex scandals to touch the hem of the royal robe. King George V, old and ailing, was deeply disapproving. He belonged to a Victorian world where women's names should appear in print only 3 times: at birth, at marriage, and at death. Nadejda had violated the code. For the next 4 years, Nadejda withdrew from the spotlight. The wild, androgynous parties of the 1920s were over. The era of the bright young things, that frantic, drug-fueled dance on the edge of the volcano, was burning itself out. Europe was darkening. Hitler was screaming from podiums in Berlin. The Spanish Civil War was tearing the continent apart. The hedonism that had defined Nadejda's youth now seemed brittle, almost grotesque in the face of the gathering storm. She retreated to Linden Manor, her country estate in Berkshire. Here, away from the prying eyes of London, she attempted to reconstruct a life of quiet domesticity. But even here she was an anomaly. She was a Russian exotic trapped in the English countryside. She still wore her trousers. She still smoked her dark tobacco. And she still maintained her intense, ambiguous friendship with her sister-in-law, Edwina Mountbatten. Edwina, too, was changing. The frivolous socialite was beginning to awaken to the political realities of the world. But the bond between the two women remained, the emotional anchor of Nadejda's life. They were 2 panthers pacing in a cage of propriety, understanding each other in a way their husbands never could. But the tragedy that would truly break Nadejda was not social. It was personal. Her husband George, the 2nd Marquis of Milford Haven, was the one person who truly understood the architecture of her soul. He was a man of profound contradictions. A brilliant mathematician, a decorated naval officer, and a collector of erotica who possessed a library of curious books that would have made a sailor blush. He knew exactly who Nadejda was. He knew about the women. He knew about the scandals. And he loved her, or at least respected her, with a stoic, unshakable loyalty. They were partners in a modern, open marriage that was decades ahead of its time. In 1937, George began to fail. He was only 45 years old, a man in the prime of his intellectual life. But cancer is indifferent to genius. The decline was rapid and agonizing. For Nadejda, watching her husband wither was a terrifying dismantling of her security. George was her shield. His status as a war hero and a Mountbatten was the armor that protected her eccentricities from the full wrath of the establishment. Without him, she was just a scandalous Russian immigration. George died on April 8, 1938. His death was a hammer blow. It marked the definitive end of Nadejda's youth. At the funeral, she stood by the grave, a figure in crushing black, veiled and silent. It was a gathering of ghosts. The mourners included the remnants of the German royal families, relatives who within 18 months would be wearing the uniforms of the enemy. It was the last time the Cousins Club of Europe would gather before the slaughter began. Nadejda was now a widow. At 42, the silence in Linden Manor became deafening. She was left with her son David, who was now the third Marquis, and her daughter Tatiana. But David was young, serving in the Navy like his father, and Tatiana was forging her own life. Nadejda was alone, in a way she had never been before. The Vanderbilt scandal had stripped her of her American friends. Death had stripped her of her husband. She did what Romanovs do when faced with catastrophe. She hardened. She walled off her heart. She became formidable. The playfulness of the 1920s vanished, replaced by a steely, almost intimidating grandeur. She began to dress in severe, dark colors. Her wit, always sharp, became razored. Then came September 1939, when Neville, Chamberlain, announced that Britain was at war with Germany. It was not a surprise to N.A. It was a grim inevitability. For a woman of her background, war was not an interruption of life. It was the natural state of things. She had been born into an empire that collapsed. She had married into a family that had to change its name to survive a war. Now she was facing a third cataclysm. But this war was different. It was personal. Her son David was in the Royal Navy, commanding destroyers in the freezing Atlantic, hunting the same U-boat that his German cousins were building. Her nephew, Prince Philip of Greece, the future Duke of Edinburgh, was also in the Navy, a young midshipman desperate to prove his loyalty to Britain. Nadejda became a matriarch of warriors, waiting by the wireless for news of sinkings. Dreading the arrival of the telegram boy, the war transformed the Mountbatten women. Edwina, the former party girl, underwent a miraculous metamorphosis. She joined the St. John Ambulance Brigade, threw herself into relief work, and eventually became a tireless heroine of the Blitz, touring bomb sites and sleeping in shelters. Ney, however, did not seek the limelight. She did not put on a uniform. She fought of war in the shadows. She remained at Linen Manor, which became a sanctuary for the displaced and the weary. During the Blitz, when London was burning night after night, the sky over Berkshire would glow red in the distance. Nadejda would stand in her garden smoking her cigarette, watching the horizon burn. She knew what that fire meant. She had heard the stories of the Winter Palace burning. She knew that the world of privilege she lived in was made of paper. Her home became a strange, suspended reality. While the world fought, Nadejda maintained a rigid, almost defiant standard of living. She refused to cower. When food rationing bit hard, she managed to keep her table elegant, using the skills of a Russian exile who knew how to make soup out of nothing. She hosted officers on leave, including her nephew Philip. Young Prince Philip was a frequent visitor. He was homeless, essentially. A prince without a kingdom, his father dead, his mother Alice locked in her religious world in Athens. Nadejda became a surrogate mother figure to him. But she was not a warm, cuddling grandmother. She was Aunt Nay, cool, sophisticated, cynical. She taught him about the complexities of the world. She gave him books to read. It is said that Philip's pragmatic, unshockable view of human nature was forged in the drawing rooms of Nadejda and Edwina. He saw in Nadejda a woman who had been chewed up by the press and survived. It was a lesson he would need. But the war also brought a new, quieter kind of suffering. The separation from the continent cut Nadejda off from her past. The south of France, her spiritual home, the place of her freedom and her scandals, was now enemy territory occupied by the Nazis and the Vichy regime. The Villa Kazbek was gone. The friends she had danced with in Cannes were scattered, hiding or dead. The glass closet of the Riviera was shattered by jackboots. There's a poignant, seldom discussed chapter of Ney's war. In 1941, her sister-in-law Alice, Philip's mother, was in Nazi-occupied Athens, hiding a Jewish family. Nadejda in England was cut off from her. The two sisters-in-law, one a deaf nun, the other a scandalous widow, were fighting the same enemy on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain of war. They were the two difficult women of the family, both survivors, both misunderstood. As the war dragged on, Lyndon Manor became a repository of secrets. Lord Louis Mountbatten, Edwina's husband, was rising to the dizzying heights of supreme command. He was the chief of combined operations, planning the raids that would eventually lead to D-Day. He would visit Lyndon, bringing with him the weight of the war. Nadejda listened. She was one of the few people Louis could talk to who didn't want anything from him. She was family, but she was outside the chain of command. She offered him the perspective of the outsider, the Russian fatalism that said, "Do what you must, for history will crush us anyway." The stress of the war years aged her. The photographs of Ney from the mid-1940s show a woman who has been hollowed out. The sharp, feline beauty of the 1920s has softened into a heavy, brooding mask. Her eyes are tired. The cigarette holder is still there, but it looks less like an affectation and more like a crutch. In 1945, when victory was finally declared, there was no jubilation in Na's heart. The world she had loved, the cosmopolitan, fluid, aristocratic Europe, was dead. It had been bombed into rubble. The Russia of her ancestors was a Stalinist fortress. The Germany of her husband's family was a smoking ruin. The France of her youth was scarred by collaboration and shame. She looked at the new world emerging from the smoke, a world of socialism, austerity, and nuclear weapons, and she realized she was a relic. The bright young things were now middle-aged survivors. The scandal of 1934 seemed like a quaint memory from a different century. Who cared about a keyhole in Cannes when millions had died in gas chambers? But survival is a habit. Not a Mountbatten adjusted her mask. She prepared to face the post-war era not as a participant, but as an observer. She had her title, she had her secrets, and she had the enduring, unbreakable bond with Edwina. The war was over, but the long, slow twilight of her life was just beginning. She would live to see her nephew marry the future queen, to see the Mountbatten name rise to the pinnacle of power, while she remained in the shadows, the keeper of the family's darker truths. The years between 1934 and 1945 were the crucible that forged the final version of Nas Mountbatten. She entered the period as a scandalous celebrity and exited it as a hardened matriarch. The death of her husband removed her safety net, forcing her to stand alone against the judgment of society. The war removed her playground, forcing her to live in the gray reality of austerity Britain. What is remarkable is her silence. In an era when many of her contemporaries wrote memoirs or gave interviews to cash in on their fading fame, Na never spoke. She never defended herself against the Vanderbilt accusations. She never clarified the nature of her marriage. She never boasted of her influence over Prince Philip. She understood that power, real power, lies in what you do, not say. She had learned the lesson of the keyhole. Once you let the world in, they will try to destroy you. So she locked the door from the inside and threw away the key. As the post-war world dawned, bringing with it a new generation of royals and new scandals, Na Mountbatten sat in her drawing room at Lynon Manor, breathed in smoke, a silent sphinx, watching the empire fade into the sunset. The wedding of Princess Elizabeth and Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten in November 1947 was the ultimate triumph of the family that had spent 30 years reinventing itself. For the public, it was a fairy tale in technicolor, a moment of dazzling hope amidst the gray austerity of post-war rationing. But for Na Mountbatten, sitting in the pews of Westminster Abbey, it was a vindication of survival. She watched as her nephew, the penniless prince she had fed and sheltered at Lynon Manor, stood at the altar. Beside him as best man stood her own son, David, the third Marquis of Milford Haven. The two young men, tall, handsome, and impeccably naval, were the future. They were the new face of the monarchy, modern, dashing, and seemingly untouched by the trauma of the past. But Na knew better. She looked at Philip and saw the boy who had been abandoned by a mad mother and a playboy father. She looked at David and saw the son of a war hero who had died too young. Na sat there, a figure of dark, majestic elegance in an ocean of pastel hats. She was now 51 years in. The sharp edges of her youth had softened into a heavy, imposing dignity. She was the aunt of the groom, the sister-in-law of the king's aide, the mother of the best man. The establishment had been forced to embrace her again. The scandal of 1934 was not forgotten, but it was politely ignored, buried under the avalanche of Mountbatten ambition. Yet even in this moment of glory, Na remained an outsider. The new Elizabethan age was dawning, an era of domesticity, family values, and rigid propriety. It was a world designed for women like the young queen, not for women like Na. She belonged to the jazz age, to the era of decadence and fluid sexuality.
As the organ music swelled, she must have realized that her role in this new play was to be the silent matriarch, the keeper of secrets that must never be whispered in front of the children. The 1950s brought a strange, suspended quiet to Na's life. With her son David Gran and her daughter Tatiana married, Linden Manor became a fortress of memory. Na spent her time reading, smoking, and maintaining a correspondence with the scattered remnants of the European aristocracy. She became a figure of awe to the younger generation. Her grandchildren would later recall a woman who was scary, but fascinating. A grandmother who didn't bake cookies but told stories about czars and poets. Her voice raspy, from decades of Turkish tobacco, she began to return to the south of France. But the Riviera of the 1950s was not the Riviera of the 1920s. The wild bohemian paradise had become a tourist trap. The villas were being sold to American industrialists. The casinos were filled with tourists in polyester rather than grand dukes in tuxedos. Nadejda rented apartments in Cannes Walking, the Promenade de la Croisette like a ghost. She visited the places where she and Gloria Vanderbilt had laughed, where the Mountbatten girls had scandalized the waiters. The ghosts were everywhere, but the joy was gone. It was a pilgrimage to a graveyard of pleasure. The emotional anchor of her life remained Edwina. Her sister-in-law had become a global figure, the last vice of India, a woman of immense political stature. Edwina and Louis Mountbatten were now world historical figures, navigating the partition of India and the end of the empire. But whenever Edwina returned to England, she went to Na. The bond was unbreakable. They were two sides of the same coin. Edwina the public saint, Nada the private sinner. They shared a cynicism about the world, a weariness that comes from seeing too much history. Then came the final blow. In early 1960, Edwina embarked on a grueling tour of the Far East for the St. John Ambulance Brigade. She was 58 years old, exhausted, her heart weakened by decades of relentless activity and stress. In North Borneo, on the morning of February 21st, she was found dead in her bed. She had simply stopped. The news shattered Na. George's death had taken her protection. Edwina's death took her soul. The Mountbatten girls were no more. The funeral of Countess Mountbatten of Burma was a spectacle of empire. She was buried at sea off the coast of Portsmouth, in accordance with her wishes as a naval wife. Lord Louis Mountbatten, dressed in his full admiral's uniform, stood on the deck of the destroyer HMS Wakeful, weeping openly as the coffin slid into the gray waves. Na was there. She stood on the deck, the wind whipping her black veil, watching the ocean swallow the woman who had been her partner in adventure, her confidant, and, in the eyes of the world, her lover. Was a desolation beyond words. The sea had always defined the Mountbattens. It was where their husbands served. It was where their power lay. Now it was a tomb. After Edwina's death, Na began to fade. The light went out of her eyes. She retreated further into herself. The world of the 1960s was exploding with a new kind of revolution. Rock and roll, sexual liberation, youth culture. But NATO wanted no part of it. It was a vulgar imitation of the rebellion she had led 40 years earlier. She had invented the short hair and the trousers. She had lived the free love. She had done it all before MC Jagger was born, and she had done it with better manners. In 1963, Nada traveled to Cannes for the last time. It was fitting that she would go there to die. The Villa Casbec was gone, but the light was the same. The smell of the pine and the sea was the same. On January 22, 1963, in a nursing home in Conmount, the Martianness of Milford Haven passed away. She was 66 years old. She died as she had lived, quietly, discreetly, causing no fuss. There were no reporters outside the door. The paparazzi who chased the new generation of celebrities had no idea that the old woman dying inside
was once the most scandalous figure in New York and London. Her body was brought back to England. She was buried beside her husband George in Bray, Berkshire, England. The funeral was a gathering of the dynasty. Prince Philip was there, bowing his head to the aunt
who had taught him how to survive. Lord Louis Mountbatten was there, bearing the last link to his own youth. Her death was noted quietly within the family, and the royal circle with public attention largely elsewhere. The inscription on her grave is modest. It lists her name and her dates. It does not mention the Romanovs. It does not mention Pushkin. It certainly does not mention Gloria Vanderbilt. It is a monument to respectability, the final mask worn by a woman who spent her life hiding in plain sight. But as the earth was shoveled onto her coffin, a silence descended that was heavier than grief. It was the silence of a library burning down. Nadejda Mountbatten took her secrets with her. She left no memoir. She burned her letters. She destroyed her diaries. She belonged to a generation that believed privacy was the ultimate luxury, and she guarded hers until the bitter end. With her death, the last direct link to the glorious, tragic, decadent world of the pre-revolutionary Russian court was severed. The bright young things were now ghosts. The keyhole in Cannes was just a story. The panther had finally gone to sleep. The death of Nadejda Mountbatten in 1963 went largely unnoticed by the general public. The world was obsessed with the Profumo affair, the Beatles, and the Cold War. The passing of an obscure marchioness seemed irrelevant. But in the private corridors of the royal family, her absence was felt as a shift in the tectonic plates. She was the last of the difficult women, the ones who remembered the old world, who knew where the bodies were buried, and who refused to be impressed by the pomp of the modern monarchy. She had been the dark mirror to the royal family's bright image. While they projected stability, she embodied chaos. While they stood for tradition, she represented survival. Her legacy, however, lived on in the most unexpected place, in the steeliness of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh's famous intolerance for nonsense, his razor-sharp wit, and his refusal to be bullied by the press. These were traits he had honed at the dinner table of Aunt Na. She had taught him that the world is a dangerous place for a royal, and that the only way to survive is to build a shell so hard that nothing can crack it. Nadejda's story is a tragedy of timing. Had she been born 50 years later, she would have been an icon of the LGBTQ+ community, a fashion legend, a celebrated rebel. Instead, she was forced to live in the twilight, defined by a scandal she didn't provoke and a love she couldn't name. She was a woman ahead of her time, waiting for a world that would never quite arrive. For decades after her death in 1963, Nadejda Mountbatten was effectively erased from the official narrative of the British aristocracy. She became a footnote in the biographies of her more famous relatives. She was listed simply as the wife of George, the mother of David, the aunt of Philip. To the casual historian, she was just another stern-faced Victorian relic in the background of royal wedding photos, her dark Romanov eyes obscured by the brim of sensible hats. The House of Windsor is expert at the art of forgetting, and Nadejda was a memory they were keen to let fade. The scandal of 1934 was treated like a radioactive isotope, buried deep in concrete, intended to be untouched for centuries. But history is a restless ghost. It dates not stay buried. As the 20th century drew to a close and the new millennium dawned, the locked filing cabinets of the past began to creak open. The war of a new generation of historians, obsessed not with battles and treaties, but with the private lives and hidden identities of the ruling class, turned a forensic lens on the Mountbatten clan. And there, hiding in plain sight, was Na. The resurrection of Nadejda Mountbatten began not in London, but in the dust of American legal archives. Decades later, journalists and historians revisited the case through surviving court accounts and contemporary press coverage, and the scandal resurfaced in a very different cultural climate. What they found was shocking. They found a narrative that contradicted the sanitized version of royal history. They found a woman who shattered every stereotype of her class and gender. Read with modern eyes, the testimony of Marie Caillot, the maid at the keyhole, no longer reads like an indictment of depravity. Instead, it reads as a testament to a forbidden, courageous love. We see Na not as the predatory lesbian of the 1930s tabloids, but as a woman attempting to carve out a space for her own desires in a world that criminalized them. The unnatural acts described in the courtroom were simply acts of intimacy between two women who found solace in each other. The reevaluation of Na's life coincided with the explosion of interest in queer history. Suddenly, the Mountbatten girls, Na and Edwina, were no longer just eccentric sisters-in-law. They were recognized as pioneers of a kind. They were women who lived in a glass closet, visible yet untouchable, protected by their privilege, but imprisoned by the need for discretion. Historians began to piece together the fragments of their lives, the shared tents in the desert, the separate bedrooms from their husbands, the intense emotional reliance on one another. The revelation was not just about sex, it was about survival. We now understand that Na's masculine style, the short hair, the trousers, the smoking, was not just a fashion statement, it was a form of armor. By adopting the signifiers of male power, she was rejecting the passive, decorative role assigned to aristocratic women. She was claiming the right to move through the world with the same freedom as her husband. In a psychological sense, she was the true heir to her Romanov ancestors. Autocratic, willful, and utterly uninterested in the opinions of the peasantry. This historical rehabilitation has transformed Na from a figure of shame into a figure of dark, compelling glamour. She is now seen as a proto-queer icon of high society. She represents the thousands of women in history whose loves were erased, whose letters were burned, and whose lives were flattened into the role of spinster or widow. Na refused to be flattened. Even in her silence, she occupied space. She forced the New York Supreme Court to acknowledge her power, even if she had to deny her identity to do it. But the most profound legacy of Nadejda Mountbatten lies in the DNA of the modern British monarchy. It is a legacy of resilience. She was the bridge between the old, doomed world of the European empires and the modern, media-savvy world of the Windsor. She taught the family the most important lesson of the 20th century: adaptability. Her son, David, the third Marquis of Milford Haven, carried her dark good looks and her love of the Navy, but he struggled with the weight of the family name, dying in 1970, just 7 years after his mother. But it was in her nephew, Prince Philip, that Nadejda's spirit truly lived on. The Duke of Edinburgh's famous stoicism, his refusal to complain, his ability to walk 2 steps behind the Queen while maintaining his own fierce independence. This was the Mountbatten Code forged in the drawing rooms of Linden Manor. Nadejda had taught him that feelings were private, that the public was a beast to be tamed, and that survival required a skin of steel. Today, if you visit the Isle of Wight, the grave of the Marchioness offers no clue to the firestorm she once ignited. It is a quiet, respectable English grave, but the story surrounding it has changed. The visitors who come now do not come to pay respects to a royal aunt. They come to find the wheelman who dared to live a double life. They come to find the girl with the mon, the lesbian Marchioness, the survivor of the Romanov curse. The tragedy of Na's life was that she could never be whole. She lived in a time that demanded she slice herself in two, the public wife and the private lover. She paid the price for that division in isolation and silence. But in the end, she won the long game. The scandal that was meant to destroy her has become the very thing that makes her immortal. The Vanderbilt family, who tried to use her as a weapon of shame, eventually imploded under the weight of their own dysfunction. Little Gloria Vanderbilt grew up to be a sad, fragile figure haunted by the trial. But the Mountbattens endured. They adapted. They survived. As we look back on Nadejda Mountbatten from the vantage point of the 21st century, the judgment of history is clear. She was not a villain. She was a casualty of a repressive age, a woman who possessed too much life for the narrow container society had built for her. She was a Romanov who refused to die, a Mountbatten who refused to conform, and a woman who refused to apologize. The keyhole in can is no longer a symbol of voyeuristic shame. It is a portal through which we can finally see the truth. And the truth is that Mountbatten was magnificent. She walked through the fire of the 20th century, her cigarette holder clenched in her teeth, her head high, carrying the secrets of an empire in her heart. The silence is finally broken, and the Queen of the Shadows can finally step into the light. There is one final image of that haunts the imagination. It is not the courtroom in New York, nor the deck of the destroyer at Edwina's funeral. It is a quiet moment in the 1950s at the Villa Casbec in Cannes, shortly before it was sold. Imagine her, standing on the terrace at twilight, looking out over the Mediterranean. The air is thick with the scent of jasmine and the salt of the sea. She is old now, her face lined, her movements slow. She lights a cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating those dark, heavy eyes for a brief second. What is she thinking about? Is she thinking of the snows of Russia she never saw? Is she thinking of the husband who allowed her to be free? Or is she thinking of the nights in the desert with Edwina, under the vast, indifferent stars, when, for a few fleeting hours, she did not have to be a marchioness or a mother or a scandal? We will never know. Mountbatten took that final thought with her into the dark. In a world that sells every secret for a price, her silence was her final defiant act of nobility. She left us only the outline of her life, a silhouette against the burning sky of history, inviting us to guess, to wonder, and ultimately to understand that some things are too precious to be adult mint.